Right now, the government are trying to push anti-strike legislation through Parliament. The Minimum Service Levels Bill, if it passes, will give certain public sector employers the right to force workers to continue to deliver services during strikes and fire them if they refuse. One argument in favour of the bill that the Tories have made time and time again is this.
This shouldn't be controversial. The International Labour Organization supports minimum service levels. We have, they're present in France, in Italy, in Spain. Normally, he's in favour of more European alignment, Mr. Speaker. Why not now?
The legislation simply brings us into line, as my honourable friend and others are just saying, with many other modern European nations. Countries like Spain and Italy and France and Ireland have introduced minimum service levels, which they use in a common sense way to reduce the impact of strikes. The International Labour Organization itself states minimum service levels can be a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike with the need to protect the wider public, and that is what we are doing. Our own unions subscribe to and support the ILO, and that is what we support as well.
The United States, I gave the example, 32 out of 50 states have an outright ban on public sector strikes. That includes New York. Other states like Canada, Australia, Italy and Spain all have embedded in statute minimum service levels that apply to important public services that are often drawn much more widely than the government's proposing. They include things like waste collection, postal services, broadcast services, the administration of justice, water distribution and energy supply. And I pick these out, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not just because they're random examples, but because every single one of these states is a member of the International Labour Organization. They are bound by exactly the same rules as us, and they are among our closest comparators around the world.
So the last person you saw there was Laura Farris. She was talking about public sector strike bans, including in the US. And on one level, she is right. In New York, for example, the Taylor law bans public sector workers going on strike. In that state, public sector unions can be slapped with big fines for taking industrial action, and their leaders can be jailed. So she seemed to be suggesting, well, it's worse in the United States. Why can't our unions accept that here? Well, the reason we shouldn't is because she's wrong to say that the law in America is consistent with the statutes of the International Labour Organization. That's the UN body that sets labour standards that all of these ministers keep appealing to. They keep saying, oh, the ILO backs what we're doing. They back all of these restrictive laws elsewhere and they back them here. Well, they don't actually. In 2016, the ILO said that the Taylor law in New York violates the human rights of New York public sector workers, while in 2011, it rebuked the state for failing to live up to its labour obligations. And the International Labour Organization doesn't seem keen on the proposed Tory laws in minimum services either. In particular, Sunak's and Schaap's claim that the ILO supports minimum service levels came as a surprise to its Director General, Gilbert Ungbo. The BBC's Faisal Islam spoke to him at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
I'm not aware of any bilateral discussion on this matter. We are very worried that workers may have to accept situation so they don't get themselves out of job. They may have to accept situation that is below par.
And it wasn't only the ILO that seems to disagree with the government's bill. The US Labour Secretary Martin J. Walsh was keen to chip in too. Now, The Guardian reports this. After hearing Ungbo's comments, that's the ILO General Secretary, the US Labour Secretary Martin J. Walsh was cited as urging the broadcaster to ask him for his thoughts, clearly keen to express his viewpoint on whether he supported minimum service levels. Walsh said, "No, I don't know about the legislation, but I certainly will work with the ILO. The United States is a board member of the ILO as well. I would not support anything that would take away from workers." So both the International Labour Organization and the US government appear sceptical of Sunak's plans to restrict workers' rights to strike. And they were happy to express that view at the world's biggest pro-business meeting. That's at Davos, right? This is not them sort of appealing to labour unions. I mean, they're appealing to the world's elites, right? And they're saying this. So it seems to me pretty embarrassing for the government. And unsurprisingly, it led to Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, to criticise the government on social media. She said, "This Grant Shapps has been hiding behind warped and willful misunderstandings of the ILO code in his desperate attempts to justify this shoddy, unworkable and vindictive piece of legislation. Now he's been found out and served with a stinging rebuke." Now, if you watched our show on Monday, you would have seen my interview with a Labour law expert explaining why the Tories were being so disingenuous when they claimed that their law was backed by the International Labour Organization and that it was, liberal compared to many of our peer nations. He debunked that. Now the ILO themselves seem to be debunking it. And bizarrely, the US government. I mean, Rivka, what do you make of this? Are they going to have to stop trotting out these arguments now that the ILO has weighed in with what they actually think?
I am old enough to remember about less than a year and a half ago when Dawn Butler was thrown out of the House of Commons for calling Boris Johnson a liar. Rishi Sunak and Grant Shapps are descended from a long line of Tory liars. In fact, sometimes I think that you sort of have to fail a lie detector test to get into the Tory party. These are hereditary liars. There's something in their blood. So I don't think anything is going to stop them lying, really. But I think, in some ways, what's interesting is that they've been caught in their lie. And in particular, that, it's funny that they felt the need to lie about any of this, the need to lie about having international support for their union-busting anti-strike legislation. Respect for international conventions on civil liberties and human rights has never been a Tory priority. That's why they want to take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. So if anything, I'm pretty surprised that in this case, the Tories have called for international backup.
Yeah, they very much pick and choose, don't they? So they're clearly not committed to international rules and regulations. But in this case, they were, naive enough to think that actually they did support, they did think that what they were saying would be in line with the International Labour Organization. It's not. But I remember actually when we spoke to an officer at the FBU, so the Fire Brigades Union, he was saying, look, fine, if the Tories want to talk international comparisons when it comes to union rights, we're happy to do that. Because the Tories say, let's have minimum service laws. They do it in France, they do it in Spain, they do it in Germany. But when you say, if we're looking at France, Germany, and Spain, why don't we elect workers to boards? Why don't we have statutory collective bargaining between trade unions and employers? Why don't we have a 35-hour work week like they have in France, right? And they're like, we don't need to compare ourselves to those countries. They compare themselves to those countries when they want to bring in any kind of restrictive law when it comes to the rights of workers to represent themselves. And then as soon as we look at what those countries are actually like, where they do, on the whole, have more rights than we have here, no. We don't need to look at what they do in Europe. We've got nothing to do with Europe. We're going to leave all of their statutes, as you say, Rivka. We want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, so I don't care what they do in Germany and France. Well, you did when you wanted to introduce the restrictive law. So it's all a little bit transparent.